one figure from the Lincoln County War remains immortal, Billy the Kid, but the only person that he was actually afraid of in the entire state of New Mexico remains lost to history. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. When the Lincoln County War began in Lincoln County, New Mexico in 1877, it gave birth to one of the most legendary figures of the American West in Billy the Kid. But there's two sides to every story, and the side of the Murphy-Dolan faction also should have a legendary figure. He just wasn't. This man, of course, is known as Jesse Evans and his gang, the Boys. Jesse Evans was born in 1853 in Missouri. However, some historians believe that it could have also have been Texas. Not a lot is known about his early life, but what is known is that he was actually a graduate of what is now Washington and Lee University. Sometime when he was around 18 years old, he and his parents were arrested for passing counterfeit bills. It seems that the authorities took pity on Jesse because of his youth and let him go. He did what a lot of enterprising young men did back then and headed west to seek his fortune. Originally, Jesse began work as a cowboy in northern New Mexico around Donna Ana County for John Chisholm, also one of the more legendary figures of the Old West. That work really didn't suit Jesse all that well. It was a lot of work, tedious work. So he took up with a known gang of outlaws led by John Kinney. They were known as the Rio Grande Posse, also covering loosely the Lincoln County and Donna Ana County areas of New Mexico. Over the course of the next couple of years, he and John Kinney would become quite close, and this is where Jesse developed the skills to become one of the baddest gunfighters of the American West. One night in a saloon in New Mexico, Kinney, as well as Jesse Evans and the rest of their gang, got into it with some U.S. cavalry soldiers. Inevitably, some shots were exchanged. One soldier and one member of the Rio Grande Posse lay dead, and John Kinney seriously wounded. At that point, Jesse Evans took some of the members of the John Kinney gang and formed his own gang, called the Jesse Evans Gang by historians, but they loosely collectively called themselves the Boys. The Boys spent the next year or so tracking down all of the members of the cavalry troop that they could responsible for the gunfight in the saloon. It was this reputation that allowed him to get on the radar of the Murphy-Dolan faction. In fact, he was hired previously to the Lincoln County War by Murphy-Dolan in what they perceived to be the coming fight with John Tunstall and the Lincoln County regulators. On February 18th, 1878, Jesse Evans and some other members of his gang intercepted John Tunstall returning from home, and he was assassinated, lighting the fuse that would be the Lincoln County War. Over the next brief period of time, he and Billy the Kid would be sort of the main point men for the rival factions. In fact, it's interesting to note that Billy the Kid verbally numerous times, and one time even in writing to Governor Lew Wallace, stated that he was afraid of Jesse Evans and that he was fearful if he was let loose from incarceration of being assassinated by he and his gang. During the Battle of Lincoln, the score came out 3-3, 3 dead regulators and 3 dead of the Murphy-Dolan faction. Of course, neither Billy or, interestingly enough, Jesse Evans were ever wounded in these exchanges. Right after the Lincoln County War, Jesse Evans and another member of his gang were caught by a sheep farmer rustling sheep. His friend was shot and killed, and Jesse was seriously wounded. Right around that same period of time, they were tried and ultimately convicted of the murder of an attorney named Chapman, who was hired by Susan McSween to represent her case in the Lincoln County War. He was ultimately incarcerated for a while, but walked away seemingly from a work detail around 1882. He was quickly apprehended, though, and then he did the rest of his time in Huntsville, Texas. Upon release in 1882, mysteriously, the person known as Jesse Evans just disappears literally from the face of history until 1948. In 1948, a fellow named Joe Hines living in Florida filed a writ with the probate court so that he could obtain his recently deceased brother's lands. The court sent a probate investigator to interview Joe Hines by the name of Morrison. The two immediately hit it off, and after several meetings and lengthy conversations, Joe Hines revealed to Morrison that he was in fact Jesse Evans. But he had another more interesting part of the story, which was he told Morrison where he could find Billy the Kid. He refuted the fact that Billy the Kid had ever died, shot by Pat Garrett, of course. In fact, he even told him where he lived and the name that he was living under, of course, an assumed name of O.L. Roberts. There were only a few members left of the Murphy-Dolan faction as well as the Lincoln County regulators at that time. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that historians mostly threw away the idea that O.L. Roberts was in fact Billy the Kid, every living member of the Murphy-Dolan and regulators stated that O.L. Roberts was in fact Billy the Kid. Ironically, we'll never know whether or not O.L. Roberts was in fact Billy the Kid or Joe Hines was actually Jesse Evans. I find it interesting, however, that all the other living members of the gang knew of the whereabouts of the two main rivals. Speaking of rivalries, historians can't really agree on the fact of whether or not that Billy the Kid and Jesse Evans knew one another prior to the Lincoln County War, or perhaps even rode together as friends. It makes for great movie stuff, but nobody can really prove or disprove that that was the case. And perhaps another cruel twist of historical fate, Joe Hines' story was never proven either. There's no evidence to suggest he was, and there's no evidence to suggest he wasn't Jesse Evans. Historians cannot agree because there's just not enough facts remaining to agree upon. I find it amazing that however all of this works in the stars in the universe, that one figure from the Lincoln County War remains immortal, Billy the Kid, but the only person that he was actually afraid of in the entire state of New Mexico remains lost to history. Well, maybe that's how it is if you're Joe Hines. You can live up until the 1940s in relative anonymity. I think it's more likely that Jesse Evans figured out that there was a very short career length in being an Old West gunfighter and being hunted by the law. Which, by the way, there were so few members of his gang left because after the murder of the attorney Chapman, they were hunted down one by one and as far away as Mexico by the Texas Rangers. It's much easier to live a life as an ordinary citizen in the state of Florida than at the end of the gun in the state of New Mexico. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and don't be afraid to like and subscribe.